Good morning. We're very happy to have Professor Peter Fritzsche of the University of Illinois coming to talk to Noisy Reality about his book that he published several years ago, Hitler's First 100 Days. Professor Fritzsche has taught at the University of Illinois since 1987. He is well known for his books on the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazis. Another book he did, Life and Death in the Third Reich. And his 10th book, When World War II Engulfed the Globe, will be coming out from Basic Books in the fall. I'll just go over some of his books quickly for those of you who are not familiar with his work. And I'm going to start not with this cartoon, of course, which we will perhaps use later on, but these books, A Nation of Flyers, Stranded in the Present, his book, Germans into Nazis, Life and Death in the Third Reich, Reading Berlin, 1900, The Turbulent World of Franz Gall. I don't think I got everything, Professor Fritsch. And then what we'll be talking about today, Hitler's First 100 Days and Rehearsals of Fascism. But we're very happy to have Professor Fritsch joining us. Thank you so much for taking time today to spend time with us on Noisy Reality and Pacifica. Thank you, Peter.
My pleasure.
Well, first of all, I want to ask you a question about how we understand Hitler in a general sense. There are literally tens of thousands of books on Hitler and Nazi Germany. It's a constant source of fascination with the public, but there's always these battles over interpretation. I'm more familiar with the battles over interpretation that have to do with Hitler in the relationship of the Second World War, the fights about intentionality versus functionalism with the Holocaust, and questions of, well, why does this happen? Why do we have an Adolf Hitler to start with? Is it the fact that Germany didn't have an 1848 revolution, which some historians have argued for decades, or what? How do you see that debate, and what is your take on it?
Well, one wants to differentiate between Hitler, the person, and the Nazis as a movement. The two are, of course, totally linked together. But why the Nazis emerged as Germany's largest party in just a few years is one set of questions, and then Hitler as an executive or even as a person is another. Looking at the World War II perspective, Hitler is a key player. I mean, almost all of the major decisions that were made in World War II, from the timing and the strategy behind the invasion of France to the invasion of the Soviet Union, and all the major strategic decisions taken in 1941-42 really come from Hitler. And the Holocaust is also not imaginable without Hitler's authority and the office of the Reich Chancellor in Berlin. It is impossible to conceive of these events without huge amounts of cooperation and complicity. But if you were to just take out Hitler, it's just very difficult to imagine the Holocaust or World War II in its audacious scale. And it's that same kind of executive authority and power that he exerted over the party from its rebirth in 1925 to its success 8 years later. So he is a crucial figure, but he alone does not explain this huge movement, the largest people's movement in 20th century modern history, German history, and the speed with which it consolidated and found legitimacy and favor among the German public in the 1930s. And if the Nazis were a purely right-wing movement, they would not have succeeded. So they always thought of themselves. They didn't think of themselves as right or left. They preferred actually to think of themselves as the center, but they didn't really think in terms of left and right. They represented an eternal Germany. And that was an ambiguous identification, but it was both nationalist and socialist. It embraced workers. It embraced the modern era and mass politics. It wasn't democratic, but it was comfortable with democratic means. And if those things were not present, the Nazis would not have been a mass movement.
Now, you look at your title of your book. When one thinks of 100 days, 100 days, of course, you refer, of course, to Napoleon escaping from Elba and then culminating in his defeat in Waterloo, the 100 days. And then we think of FDR with his first 100 days. We think of Hitler uh, in how he comes to power. And again, the power of your book is how rapid the transformation into the Third Reich is. It's just with great speed. Um, and then, of course, the question of the 100 days is applied to other presidential administrations, other leaders. And then we get to the situation we're in now as Americans, where we're dealing with a situation where many of us are trying to understand. And I just put this cartoon up. Here we have a situation where we're living through the first 40 days of this administration. And we sort of had the analogies being made in the first term of Mr. Trump that we were dealing with a American style fascism. Some people were talking about populism, authoritarianism, etc. But I was just curious to get your take on that whole debate and the question of analogies. And of course, analogies, those of us are old enough to remember the example of Munich. We never will repeat Munich again. And then that, of course, caused us in part to go fight a war in Vietnam. So, I just wonder about the analogy issue and where do we take some sort of in-depth look at what's happened in Germany or what happened in Italy in the early 20s that may or may not have an analogy to us in the United States now? Or is it just completely so different that it's impossible in your mind to make those kind of analogies?
Well, there are huge amounts of differences, and the biggest one is that the Nazis found favor. The great fortress of Nazi success was the universities. So they had educated young people behind them, many of them in uniform. You had 400,000 SA men in 1932. And to get the equivalents for America, always multiply by five, a little bit more than five. So it's like 2 million armed, uniformed paramilitaries running around the United States today. But the analogies also, of course, Trump is not Hitler, but there are, I think, useful analogies. And to me, the biggest one is the conception of the present moment, say 2024 in the United States versus 1932 in Germany. Hitler sees it as a vast crime scene. What that means is that there are identifiable culprits who must be brought to justice. And it is not long-term structural trends of modernity or whatever that have incapacitated Germany. It is the necessity to release Germany from chains, not just Versailles, foreign policy-wise, but internal enemies, who are many. And the defeat of the internal enemy is absolutely key. And then the virtue of the German people and the German whole can be restored, and a kind of new action, and a new ability to act and to be the subject of your own destiny will come. But you have to get rid of the crime scene. And these are very similar conceptions to how Trump and MAGA have looked at America in 2024, that they're identifiable criminals and culprits, and it's the key is to get rid of them, and then America virtue will be restored. The fact that it's a crime scene means it's not really long-term difficult structural trends. It also means that you have to act against those enemies who are real, and there are many of them. So it's not just for Hitler Jews. It's what he called November criminals. It's the Democrats. It's the Republicans who had um, created a constitutional democratic order in 1918, and he was determined to get rid of what he then called that system and install a pure, eternal, real German government legitimized by the German people who had been then freed from these criminals. And it's the conception of the crime scene that I think is very similar, makes 1933 similar to 2025, and requires speed of action to save the nation.
Okay. Now, let's get into the specifics of the situation in Germany itself. Uh, Describe to us your take on what is happening in 1932. I know that's a vast subject, but some of the personalities and because again, when one looks at interpretations of the rise of the Third Reich, some of us here have been, completely exposed to all the, social science theories about the rise of Nazism and fascism. We've also pretty familiar with the narrative history of the Third Reich and the biographies of history of Hitler over the past 70, 80 years, starting with Haydn and then Bullock. Uh, so, where do we differentiate between sort of great man theories of history, which do indeed play a role, and the structural factors that are operating in 1932 that explain the kind of decision making going on that puts him in power in January of 1933?
Well, what Hitler wants in 1933, when he comes to power and is put into power by the appointment of the president without any qualifications that he has to find a majority in the parliament, is he wants the ability to act. So he needs emergency legislation, and he gets that. And ultimately, he wants to revise the Constitution, i.e., suspend the Constitution, in order to act against internal enemies, but also to act in a forthright way to solve the economic problems. The economic problems are dire. So you have one-third of the country under unemployed. Now, the unemployed didn't vote on the whole for Hitler, but you have a deep, deep, deep recession in Germany, and no one would contest that economic crisis. At the same time, you have a political crisis in that you have no clear working majority in parliament. In fact, you have a negative majority with both extremes, the Nazis and the communists, being around 50%. And then you have a deeply divided country between people who are Republicans and people who are anti-Republican nationalists. And that goes right down the middle of the country and divides then the Catholic camp as well. And so there's very little executive authority. There's very little legitimacy to plan large programs, nor is there an ability in Parliament to legislate. And to and so Hitler's appointment in a way cuts through all of that, and the elites around the president finally agree that they will allow Hitler, without real strings attached, to try to solve the problem. And he is the leader of the largest party. And he is focused in the first 100 days in order to gain as much power as possible to solve the crime scene, to get rid of his enemies, and of course, to solve the economic problems that beset Germany.
Okay, one aspect that you stress, what I found fascinating, was the social function of the mobilization of the Sturmabteilung and the rallies that are going on throughout Germany. I mean, Hitler's mobilization of the public. I was very struck with one little insight you had about how there had been a decline in circuses coming in through rural Germany, and that the march and the theater of this mobilization was something that was entertaining to the public, and that perhaps was something that we tend to not underestimate in terms of its power to reach out to the masses. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the question of the mass mobilization going on, what's distinctive. He's using aircraft to travel around, etc. So what's your say on all that?
This is a completely politicized society. First of all, the number of people voting is over 80%. People have flags out on their balconies and in their windows. They're showing who they vote for. Even small towns, medium-sized towns are split. Um, the idea that you're living in a precinct where you only have Trump voters or you only have Democratic voters, which is most precincts in the United States, is completely unlike Germany at the time. Towns were very divided, and it was visually so, and things were extremely politicized. Everybody marched, everybody held rallies. Hitler's were large, but not much hugely larger than the socialists. But he was much more, he was even more organized than they. They were the biggest political machine in Germany, the socialists, and the Nazis went them even bigger. And they would march into towns on a Sunday. Sunday was the normal day of politics. And let's say the town's 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people, they were there all day. They'd have a band concert. They have a memorial for the fallen from the World War. They'd have a political speech. They'd have a parade, and totally occupied the town. Since the SA, the brown shirts were in uniform and marched in a very military way, at least those on the right could see them as the restoration of order, could see them as the new young generation that was part of the legacy of the German military, but in a sort of new, modern, contemporary, youthful fashion, um, whose primary mission was to save Germany. Not everybody was impressed, but many people were. It seemed a restoration of order, and the violence and the military posturing seemed to underscore that these people are serious. It was a sign of their resolution and determination to change Germany, and it won over people. What's interesting about Hitler and the Nazis is they are the biggest party. They moved enormously from 1928 to 1932, from 3% to over 35%, one third of the nation, but they never cracked 40%. Even in the last elections, which are, basically today's a Sunday in March, first Sunday in March, exactly 92 years ago, March 5th. That's the key date. Everything happens after that. They got 43%. In no district did they in the 14 election districts in Germany did they get more than 56%. Um, they, with their electoral allies, got 52% of the vote. And so they are not two-thirds of the society. And that's why there's always violence that accompanies the consolidation of German power, of Nazi power.
Now, the decision making between von Papen, uh, all these different parties that lead to his selection, and of course Hindenburg as chancellor, it occurs on January 30th, and then the next day, uh, within a week, they're suspending the civil rights of the population. Uh, they're repressing the next day. I believe they ban the ability to hold meetings uh, uh, for the Communist Party. They're beginning immediately to uh, ban newspapers that are dissident to them. So just talk about that, the rapidity of what's going on here to basically completely erase to them is essentially a evil that must be eradicated. That is the Weimar Republic and the heritage of the 1918-1919 revolution.
Right. Without a majority in the parliament, the chancellor is going to be chosen by the president of the republic. The president and the people around him don't particularly want to appoint Hitler. I mean, he's a vulgar man of the street. However, he's the head of the largest party. And key in all their thinking is it's much more important to destroy democracy. It's much more important to keep the socialists from regaining power. These are the moderate socialists who are the Republicans. Uh, and that's absolutely key to them. And so in the end, they hold their nose. They realize this is the modern world of mass politics, and if they're going to do if they're going to have a anti-republican government, they're going to need Hitler, and they're going to have to appoint him as chancellor. And he is not obligated to find a majority in the parliament under the conditions of his appointment. And like all other previous presidential appointments of chancellors, he is given emergency powers. He has one other absolutely powerful piece of ammunition, and that is that the federal government in Berlin has already taken over the biggest state, Prussia. They did this on July 20th, 1932, in order to get rid of the democratic government there, ostensibly in order to maintain public order. And so they booted out the democratic bastion in Germany, which is the superstate of Prussia. It's like New York, California, and Texas all rolled into one. It is three-fifths of Germany. And the federal government now has a power over the police in Prussia. And so that is the way they can ban meetings, outdoor meetings, and they can ban newspapers for up to several days or a week. And that's what they do in Prussia. But that's three-fifths of Germany. And so these emergency decrees are done through the Nazi occupation of the Interior Ministry of the Prussian state. And they also have the Prussian police now. That is what gives them the key power, the physical power, the police power, and the emergency powers to ban, to contain meetings. This is federalized with the emergency legislation that follows the Reichstag fire, which happens on the Tuesday before the Sunday elections. But it's already happened in this gigantic three-fifths of Germany state of Prussia from day one. And that's where then the terror begins at the grassroots. But the real terror and the real taking over of everything follows the Nazi electoral victory, modest as it was, exactly 92 years ago on the first Sunday of March, March 5th. And then you see a wave of violence across the country, and not just Prussia is taken over as a state, but all the others as well.
All right. Now, I'm going to say this is a picture's worth 1,000 words. So here we have a picture, you may or may not be able to see it, of Hitler on February 1st making a radio speech to the nation. Explain the power, and again, we live today with social media, with digital media, with the television, a fragmented media. We're all familiar with how different it is now, but just explain to us your interpretation of the power of radio and how you mobilize it, how him and Goebbels mobilize it to attain and achieve and maintain power.
Yeah, this is his first speech on February 1st. He's a little halting there, and he ends up re-recording it, and that's what's then sold as phonograph records. But his big speech, and that's what you will find on YouTube, is February 10th, which opens up the election campaign for the March 5th elections. What's so interesting about radio has just now gotten to the technological state where you can tune in and you can listen to radio as a group without wearing headphones. So radio has become much, much easier to deal with. Also, he's now for on radio for the first time. Unless you've been to a Hitler speech, you've never heard Hitler speak. And now he's on radio because radio is limited to government ministers and it is not seen as a political medium. And so, can other, in an election campaign, you don't have the various parties speaking on radio or given radio time. Only government ministers are allowed to speak. And so, beginning on January 30th, 1933, the Nazis in the cabinet, Goering, Frick, and Hitler, dominate the airwaves ostensibly as statesmen. And these are then broadcast nationally. And of course, the Nazi Party encourages people to listen. So there's all sorts of listening parties for those who don't have radios. There's loudspeakers set up on public spaces. People are urged to open up their windows so that the radio's sound goes into the streets and sounds like everyone's listening to the radio. So Hitler finally gets to the radio because he's chancellor. And Goering, who's also a Nazi in the cabinet, is also constantly on the radio, day after day after day. Of course, they're totally partisan, but it's because they are statesmen that they have this access to the radio. People at the time, both in the United States and Germany, also thought that radio was a more direct medium, more sort of true to life than newspapers. And so they heard the sounds in the background, the screams, the cheering, and they really thought that was a kind of plebiscite. It was kind of a acclamation of real people in real places without newsprint and editors and the delay of publication in a newspaper. Radio was direct. And people thought it was more true to life. And so it had tremendous effects. And then when Hitler speaks on the streets, let's say the 10th of March, there's also a 10th of February, there's also a big speech on the 4th of March. All the radio stations are tuned in to the speech, and there's listening parties in the streets, there's loudspeakers set up, people congregate. And all the windows are open, and you hear the radio noise out on the street. And it really suggests the entire nation is mobilized and is behind Hitler. Radio had tremendous effects.
All right. Now let's talk about the Reichstag fire. This, of course, is where we get into analogies with our time, uh, because some will argue, of course, that Trump versus U.S. last year, decided by the Supreme Court, is essentially our equivalent of an enabling act for the president. But explain your reaction to, there's been a huge battle over what happened at the Reichstag fire. Was it indeed one person who said it? Was it actually set by the Germans, by the SA? Goering supposedly admitted to doing this. Again, I don't know the veracity of that, but we know what the outcome was. We know what the outcome was, but nevertheless, where do you fall on that whole debate?
Yeah, Goering is very coy. He's a minister without portfolio as well as aviation, head of aviation, but he's also in charge of Prussia. That's his big role, Goering, at the time. And after the war, when he's on trial, he says very coyly, "I didn't need the Reichstag fire to establish police authority and emergency power in Germany." Did they do it? Did the Nazis set the fire? Did someone else set the fire? We don't know. Germans at the time certainly knew who benefited from the fire. And the people who benefited from the fire, the people who used the fire to declare a national emergency, which is the Nazis. Um, so in the vernacular opinion of the time, it certainly played into the hands of the Nazis, and so people assumed that they set the fire.
Mhm.
Scholars for a long time believed it was a lone wolf operation by a renegade communist. It was not a Communist Party operation, but it was lit by a communist. There's more and more doubt on this, and I'm of that party, and it apparently is a rogue operation inside the Berlin SA stormtroopers. It's probable that Goering knew. It's unlikely that Hitler knew, and that the Nazis lit it. It certainly does not appear to have been a government operation. In any case, it's used by the Nazis, and they begin arrests immediately and start a huge uh, investigative campaign against. It's really just propaganda. There's no real evidence. A huge propaganda campaign showing that the communists are about to strike, that they have dynamite under the bridges, that they have agents everywhere, and that only at the very last minute have the Nazis been able to save Germany from a communist coup. And Goering explains this in a hushed, melodramatic voice on the radio a couple days later, but before the crucial Sunday, March 5th elections, and confides to the German people about the huge communist danger. And all of this then justifies the emergency legislation suspending key aspects of the freedoms and liberties of the Constitution, all of which is then consolidated by national legislation 3 weeks later. And that's when the arrests begin. But they really take off after the Sunday, March 5th elections. So it's a state of emergency that the incidents of the fire, whether that was lit by rogue Nazis or rogue communists, was used by the government, by the Nazis, in order to launch a full-scale assault and dismantle the Constitution.
Now, in your book, you talk about by the end of March, 15,000 are arrested. By the end of April, 30,000 are arrested. And you have a reaction internationally. There's a major rally in New York at the Madison Square Garden, March 27th, which is taken with great umbrage in Germany, as essentially repeating the same, to some in Germany, of course, repeating the same kind of, from their point of view, lies that were brought against Germany in the First World War. That is, that we committed atrocities in Belgium, etc., and they're being repeated. And then it leads to this boycott on April 1st, where Jews are, I assume Jews are being targeted throughout the period in March, but then it becomes a direct attack on them. So just get into that aspect of it, because then you see the
Right.
question of what is being shaped as a society to take hold, and also what always is amazing when I read your book and reflect on it is how fast this happens.
Yeah.
Literally 3 months.
So like communist intellectuals or left-wing intellectuals, they know to leave on the night of the Reichstag fire. But on the whole, everything is still more or less normal until the elections on the 5th. So that's Sunday. So let's say it's today, right? It's the first Sunday in March. The elections are held. Beginning on Monday, there's a wave of violence. It's multi-pronged. It's against socialist newspapers, socialist unions, socialist and democratic politicians. It's against city governments. The Nazis are the largest party in most places. They might not have a majority, but they're the largest party. And on the basis of that, they take over here a town hall, then the states, here a county government. They just take it all over. That happens in about 2 weeks, but it all begins the Monday after those March 5th elections. And now with violence, burning down buildings, beating people, arresting people, throwing them into prison if it's the police who are arresting them, but if it's the Nazi paramilitaries who are arresting them, then it's in these underground prisons that might be in a bar or in a basement someplace. An enormous wave of violence, and by the end of the week, so by the 7th or 8th, 9th of March, it's also against Jews, Jewish pedestrians, Jewish stores, Jewish organizations. There's some murders and kidnappings that take place, and this gets to the international press. So by the end of that week, and certainly into the next one, so we're talking about mid-March 1933, there are all sorts of stories coursing around about arbitrary violence perpetrated by Nazis, not the criminal justice system. And on March 20th, the first concentration camps open, and that's reported in the newspapers. So that is now run through the Ministry of the Interior. And that gets into the New York Times. There's rallies held in London and Paris and New York decrying Nazi crimes against political opponents as well as Jews. And these culminate in a big Madison Square Garden rally on March 27, 1933. The Nazis used this as a pretext for punishing Jews at home. They will punish Jews at home by launching a party organized boycott of Jewish businesses all around Germany. And the party and the brown shirts will identify these businesses, and then there'll be pickets, and there will be a storm of protest by the German people against this international opinion. But you're actually boycotting German Jews for what Madison Square Garden public is doing. But it's all just these are just pretexts, because on April 7th, the Ministry of the Interior, the government, rolls out a cleansing of the bureaucracy legislation. And it enables local, state, and federal authorities to get rid of political enemies on the basis of the emergency legislation. And so they cleanse the bureaucracy from teachers, postal workers, to university professors of Democrats and socialists. This is discretionary based on, what town hall is doing it. But not discretionary is the termination of all Jewish employees without pension. And this is done on the basis of identifying Jews identifies anyone with one Jewish grandparent. And so Jews are also terminated. That is not discretionary. But the point of the legislation is also to get rid of political enemies. And of course, there's far more political enemies in the bureaucracy than there are Jews. And this shows that's where the Nazis are headed. The exclusion of Jews from civic life and the demolition of political opponents by removing them from the all parts of government, including the post office carrier, the mailman. So that proves that the boycott is it's just a propaganda pretext to get at German Jews and to mobilize the public on the basis of Germany's um, victim status in World War One. That all the propaganda, all the world is against us. They won't let us do what we want. We're being peaceful here in our national revolution, and yet the foreign powers think that they can tell us what to do. And so it draws on the resentments against Versailles and against the defeat and the resentments from World War One in order to mobilize the German population behind the anti-Jewish action. But the real point is to cleanse the bureaucracy at all levels of political opponents. And that's what happens on April 7th.
Okay, now I'm going to bring people just raise your hands, and I'll bring people in the order that they raise their hands to ask questions and comments. Um, just before that occurs, I was really struck in your book with the discussion of Protestantism and the kind of debates going on in Protestantism in Germany and how the Third Reich is received enthusiastically by most Protestants. And what I was, and I think, of course, I think about the kind of situation we've been dealing with in our society with fundamentalist Christianity and the politicization of it since the 1970s. People could go farther back than that, of course, maybe to Billy Graham in the post-war period. But what struck me was when you had this quote in, I don't know if it's in 1933, I think it was 1937, 38, of a rally where Protestant ministers talking about the need to ban the Jewish Old Testament, and then
Yeah, that's summer 33.
summer 33, and then uh, reinterpret the New Testament to take out the pacifistic, I guess, take out the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, and then replace that with essentially, Norse mythology. And I just, and I see people raise their hand, thanks, but just before we get into that and hear these people say, like, what's your thought about that? Because that really did strike me as something similar to the kind of things we're going through as a society now, although I could be wrong.
German uh, German Protestantism is a beleaguered institution, but still a strong one. I mean, people get confirmed, they have funerals, they get married in church, but its influence is waning. People are leaving the church, and therefore the church is losing tax receipts. But what's left of the Protestant church, and is still very powerful, there's a strong current in it that identifies very much with the nationalist resurgence in Germany, a resurgence of order and of German pride, and a movement against the atheist republic. And so the many German Protestants as a whole are very, very drawn, active Protestants are very, very drawn to Hitler's movement. And a large number of them, it ends up probably being a large minority, are very much in favor of Nazifying Protestantism in the ways that you suggest, that it's not a religion of mercy, does not stand in for the weak, uh, and um, and wants to get rid of many of the aspects of the Old Testament, and indeed any Jewish influences, and including uh, Protestant ministers who might have Jewish grandparents but had converted. So that's a large minority in Germany. That's what you hear, with I quote in July 1933. Ultimately, there's a pullback from that, and that church should be church and state should be state. That doesn't exonerate Protestants at all. They're still quite sympathetic to Hitler, but they don't want this huge mesh of Nazism with Protestantism in this totally vulgar way. And neither does Hitler. He doesn't want that to happen to his Nazi movement either. And so this strain of kind of racial Protestantism continues in Germany, but it doesn't become all powerful. And most Protestants probably settle into a more quiescent position, similar to the Catholics, that the state does what the state does, but our relationship remains with God, and church is church, state is state. But that still underwrites so many of the Third Reich's policies. It's a very quiescent and passive policy. But the most vulgar, assertive um, amalgamation of Protestantism and Nazism is a large plurality, but not a majority. And that's how it plays itself out over the course of the 30s.
Yeah, thank you. Frank, go on, Frank.
Yes, this is very good. Regarding the Reichstag fire, um, there's a number of anomalies, and I don't quite understand. You get it in Conrad Hayden, but not in others like Joachim Fest. And at the trial that followed, you've got Georgy Dimitrov, who is actually the head of Comintern in Europe. And so this whole rounding up of communists and guaranteeing that they're going to get a majority because the KPD was huge and they basically sort of outlawed it. It doesn't make any sense to me that Dimitrov managed to run rings around Goering at the trial and then just walks away. And the second thing is, there's an analogy today with Elon Musk saying, "Hey, we need to get out of the UN," because in October of 33, Hitler got out of the League of Nations, and this is weird. But yeah, could you address both of those, please? Yeah.
Well, if you have a show trial, which is involved the communists, including Dimitrov, in the winter of 33, 34, since you have a show trial that it is public, you are constrained by certain rules of what a show trial is. I don't know the ins and outs of the trial. Dimitrov himself is acquitted, but they are able to peg this communist, and there is evidence that he did it. There's also now new evidence that rogue Nazis actually did it, and not just one of them, but a whole team of them, and that explains why the fire was set at different places. But I don't know about the actual crime scene so much. I certainly know that the Nazis used it when they needed it, and that was March 1933. By December, it doesn't really matter what happens. The the Nazis, following the Japanese example, left the League of Nations, and they got a German plebiscite, a German vote in November to back that. And they were not going to be constrained by the order and rules and process of the international community that had revised German reparations and brought Germany back into the fold. In fact, giving it a seat on the Executive Council of the League of Nations, awarded the Olympics to Germany at the end of 1932 for the year 1936, allowed Germany to compete in international sporting events since 1925, and it was appeared in the 28 Amsterdam Olympics. So Hitler goes against all of that international comity, which was not proceeding at the pace that many Germans wanted, but seemed to be the only way forward. Also, with legal obligations, with reparations, and with the departure of Allied troops off of German soil and the like. All of this seemed that Germany should participate in the international community, and then Hitler pulls out in October 1933 to go completely alone or pursue one-to-one relationships with states. but yeah, he turns his back on the international community and gets the Germans to vote 90% plus in favor of that. That's what you also see at the in the present. Yeah.
All right, Michael. Yeah. Michael, unmute, please. Mike? Alex. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I was having a
Go
little
ahead.
problem unmuting. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I'd like to really basically two questions, one larger one and one more specific. I'd like to talk about or like you to talk about what you believe Hitler, the man, Hitler, the person, these personal attributes, how they, or personal peccadillos, if we can call it that, how they played into all of this and how they played into um, uh, his image in the to the German people, or if they played at all, were they totally separate, or how did they affect his thinking, his politics, basically the aspects of the person himself. Also, there is a quote attributed to Hitler. Somebody had once asked him, and I wanted to know if you knew anything about this or how, if it could be verified, that somebody had asked him what was the real reason for getting rid of the Jews. In other words, we say they're gangsters or communists or whatever. Um, but that his answer was because the Jews are responsible for the two ideas, the two aspects that are the enemies, the antithesis of German nationalism. And when asked what they were, he said that Oriental despot and his supposed son, obviously referring to God and Jesus. I wonder if you knew anything about that quote and if that quote exemplifies what Hitler and the Nazi attitude was. That's two different questions.
Right, going backwards, if you are going to murder people who are innocent, then you're murdering God. And it doesn't really require much theology there or Hitler's own theological interpretation. Um, if you're slaughtering the innocent, then you and the Nazis had a very hard time to install their own morality because of the default Christian morality. They achieved a lot and they got very far. But people kept saying, but these people, people are innocent or turn the other cheek or we should be merciful. And it was very difficult to get Germans to act consistently at all times and all places, not to act mercifully and not to have ideas of humanity. The Nazis hated that word, didn't believe it existed. They believed only races existed. Um, the Nazis also believed that Jews were biologically different. So it wasn't just cultural that Jews were associated with high capitalism or they weren't Christian or that they were no amount of or they were Marxist. No amount of assimilation would make a Jew okay. In fact, assimilation was the horror for the Nazis that the Jews would slip in unknown into the German people because they took the biology seriously. They had no test. But nonetheless, they acted on it, and they did so extremely consistently. And they had a horror of admixtures and Jewish blood, and acted extremely consistently, hauling people off to death who were in convents and in the ministry and the like. I don't think Hitler's youth or upbringing is exceptional, but one thing that Germans came back to again and again, and I think this is very important. First of all, he's an ordinary soldier, so he represents, and he was a brave soldier. He represents the suffering of a people's army in the war. To Americans, this is completely, they have no ability to understand this. There were 2 million German battlefield deaths in World War I in a country of 60 million people. And there are more than 2 billion serious injuries, many of them visible on the street. And he represented the ordinary soldier, the endurance, the suffering, even the bravery of the ordinary soldier. That's one. He did not come from the high command. Did not represent the rear. Very important. Number two, Hitler owned up his treason against the state in his February 1924 trial. Whereas Ludendorff and the Bavarian figures and the others involved in the trial, who were much more elite men, denied and made all sorts of excuses. Hitler owned up, said, "Yes, I did it," and he earned enormous respect for doing so as the only man in a civil suit at the trial. Not that people necessarily agreed with his aims, but they agreed with his honor and with his position of honesty. That trial made Hitler a household word in Germany, and that trial made people interested in Hitler. And I think that's the in terms of his personal makeup, I think that's extremely important. I wouldn't go into his childhood or Vienna or so on. But I think he was against the revolution. He saw it as as something that enemies had created, internal enemies, and these enemies had to be destroyed. And he stood foursquare against that, beginning at that February 24 trial. And all the other times he was ever on trial as a witness, he said, "I'm going to get those criminals. I will come to power legally, but when I am in power, I will change the Constitution and I will let the heads roll." He said that many times before he was put into power, and that's what people assumed he was going to do. And that's what he did. He went after his enemies, and heads did roll.
Indeed.
Well, I'd like to really basically two questions, one larger one and one more specific. I'd like to talk about or like you to talk about what you believe Hitler, the man, Hitler, the person, his personal attributes, how they, or personal peccadillos, if we can call it that, how they played into all of this and how they played into um, uh, his image in the to the German people, or if they played at all, were they totally separate, or how did they affect his thinking, his politics, basically the aspects of the person himself. Also, there is a quote attributed to Hitler. Somebody had once asked him, and I wanted to know if you knew anything about this or how, if it could be verified, that somebody had asked him what was the real reason for getting rid of the Jews. In other words, we say they're gangsters or communists or whatever. Um, but that his answer was because the Jews are responsible for the two ideas, the two aspects that are the enemies, the antithesis of German nationalism. And when asked what they were, he said that Oriental despot and his supposed son, obviously referring to God and Jesus. I wonder if you knew anything about that quote and if that quote exemplifies what Hitler and the Nazi attitude was. That's two different questions.
Right, going backwards, if you are going to murder people who are innocent, then you're murdering God. And it doesn't really require much theology there or Hitler's own theological interpretation. If you're slaughtering the innocent, then you and the Nazis had a very hard time to install their own morality because of the default Christian morality. They achieved a lot and they got very far. But people kept saying, but these people, people are innocent, or turn the other cheek, or we should be merciful. And it was very difficult to get Germans to act consistently at all times and all places, not to act mercifully and not to have ideas of humanity. The Nazis hated that word, didn't believe it existed. They believed only races existed. The Nazis also believed that Jews were biologically different. So it wasn't just cultural that the Jews were associated with high capitalism, or they weren't Christian, or that they were no amount of or they were Marxist. No amount of assimilation would make a Jew okay. In fact, assimilation was the horror for the Nazis, that the Jews would slip in unknown into the German people because they took the biology seriously. They had no test, but nonetheless, they acted on it, and they did so extremely consistently. And they had a horror of admixtures and Jewish blood, and acted extremely consistently, hauling people off to death who were in convents and in the ministry and the like. I don't think Hitler's youth or upbringing is exceptional, but one thing that Germans came back to again and again, and I think this is very important. First of all, he's an ordinary soldier, so he represents, and he was a brave soldier. He represents the suffering of a people's army in the war. To Americans, this is completely, they have no ability to understand this. There were 2 million German battlefield deaths in World War I in a country of 60 million people. And there are more than 2 million serious injuries, many of them visible on the street. And he represented the ordinary soldier, the endurance, the suffering, even the bravery of the ordinary soldier. That's one. He did not come from the high command. Did not represent the rear. Very important. Number two, Hitler owned up his treason against the state in his February 1924 trial. Whereas Ludendorff and the Bavarian figures and the others involved in the trial, who were much more elite men, denied and made all sorts of excuses. Hitler owned up, said, "Yes, I did it," and he earned enormous respect for doing so as the only man in a civil suit at the trial. Not that people necessarily agreed with his aims, but they agreed with his honor and with his position of honesty. That trial made Hitler a household word in Germany, and that trial made people interested in Hitler. And I think that's the in terms of his personal makeup, I think that's extremely important. I wouldn't go into his childhood or Vienna or so on. But I think he was against the revolution. He saw it as as something that enemies had created, internal enemies, and these enemies had to be destroyed. And he stood foursquare against that, beginning at that February 24 trial. And all the other times he was ever on trial as a witness, he said, "I'm going to get those criminals. I will come to power legally, but when I am in power, I will change the Constitution and I will let the heads roll." He said that many times before he was put into power, and that's what people assumed he was going to do. And that's what he did. He went after his enemies, and heads did roll.
Indeed. And that is a very powerful read, the transcripts of that trial. Go on, Craig.
Yeah, Dr. Fritz, very, very much appreciate your discussion today, and I'm certainly going to have to get a copy of your book on Hitler's first 100 days. But I have spent the last 25 years of my life or so researching and writing books about Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union and in the summer of 41. And it's been literally decades since I've gone back and looked in any detail into Hitler's rise to power, and then what happened after the so-called Machtergreifung, or the seizure of power on the 30th of January. And I've been hacking my way through one of the most recent biographies of Hitler by Ralph Reuth, which is written in very, very erudite German. So it's one of the most difficult books I've picked up to read in recent years. But he points out, in reading his book, it's very clear to me what a skillful politician Hitler became. And as an aside, you mentioned that it was only after the failure of the 24 Putsch attempt and his trial that he became a household name in Germany. That's kind of a great irony, because before that he'd just been a local rabble rouser in the Munich region, and even though that push was on its face an abject failure, it ultimately worked to his benefit. But in reading Ralph Reuth's biography, it's clear to me that a couple of things. First of all, as I said, what a skillful politician he was, because in those early years, as you know, in the 20s, there were a lot of differences between different groups of National Socialists. Goebbels and Strasser in the north had very, very significant differences with the National Socialists in the south, in southern Germany. And Hitler was very smart. Instead of jumping into those fights, he sort of backed off and stayed out of them, let them play out, and had a way of just getting people to come to his side and make them feel indispensable. So that was one thing. The second thing, I'm right up to 1928-29 in the book, and it's clear that it was only at that point that Hitler's movement really started to gain some serious traction, of course, propelled forward by the economic crisis. And the other thing that amazes me, and Jim, I think you brought it up, and Dr. Fritz, you have I think elaborated on it as well, was how quickly after the seizure of power, how quickly the Nazis just took over everything. And I also recently read Erich Metaxas's wonderful biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and that's what made my decision. Well, gee, I really need to look into these initial years of the Third Reich, because in reading Metaxas's biography of Bonhoeffer, it stunned me in just realizing how quickly and how skillfully the Nazis just shut down their opposition and just buttoned down complete control of the country. And I guess the only other thing is, you're absolutely right. He never, even in November of the elections in July of 32, when I think he got 37% of the vote. Then in November he actually fell a little bit, and then in the elections in March, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about those elections in March, on the 5th of March. I think supposedly they were free elections, but they weren't really. And Hitler got like 43.6% of the vote. But even looking at those margins and the fact that, as you point out, he never got 50% of the vote. But you look at the situation in Europe today and the elections that the Germans just had or that the French have, to get 36% or 43% of a vote in an election in France and Germany today would be absolutely astounding. It would be absolutely impossible. The CDU, what did they get? 28% of the vote in the recent election. But again, these elections in March, were they reasonably free elections still?
Yeah, I think for the purposes of this discussion, one should see them as more or less free. In Prussia, there was lots of intimidation. Uh, there were not flags of all the parties flying outside of Prussia, more so. But I think
Okay.
it's just easier to assume more or less it's free. And you're absolutely right. You there's important traction to be gained, remembering that they only got 43% after even intimidation and radio, up from their high of 37 in July 1932. But it is also significant. And in a
Yeah.
parliamentary system, it is significant. And one has to also remember that it's not all coming from the top down. The Nazis did represent what they called, or what we now call a People's Party. They had more workers than any other non-socialist party. They had more Catholics than any non-Catholic party. They were skewed sociologically, but they were more representative of the German nation than any other, in sociological terms, than any
Mm-hmm.
other German party. And so
Oh,
they could, with
interesting.
some plausibility, say, we are the new Germany. Our own party itself is the germ of the new Germany. And that's why we should simply expand the party into everything. We don't have to work with the old fashioned parties. And they were totally anti Marxist, totally anti communist, had no,
Yeah.
weren't going to socialize or increase the power of unions or anything like that. But they accepted workers, they honored workers, and they also despised the elites. And for example, in all the labor camps that then ultimately became de rigueur, required, if you were going to go, of all German boys, these 6 month labor camps for everybody were required if you were going to go onto university. So there were all sorts of ways that they needled the high, the upper middle class and the elites, and even the Heil Hitler salute should be seen as a non-deferential everyday address. And so they combined both a kind of a populist as well as an anti-communist message to great effect. And if they had not done that, they would not have gotten the votes that they did. They are not simply a extremely violent, well-organized right-wing party. They are something else. And and we're able to raid the social democratic electorate. Not most of it, but enough of it, some of it,
Yeah.
as well as the Catholics. And then even the Catholics let's say they all voted for themselves, they've all voted for the Catholic Party, but even there's a degree of sympathy for Hitler, and there's a degree of a sense that this movement will regenerate Germany, and there's lots of positive in it. And so there's a lot of positive energy and positive sympathy for the Nazis in the spring of 1933. It's not just batons and swords and pistols. A lot of people were struck first by this radio acclamation, but then they saw it on the street. and there's all sorts of choreographies. And then once everyone else starts joining, it's hard to resist because that is now the new Germany. And out of that comes energy, and in that is your future.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you, Craig.
fascinating.
Volker, do you want to comment on anything, Volker? You want to unmute, Volker? You want to jump in? Going once, going twice. All right, well, just let me know if you want to do that, Volker. Now, I have a comment from Susan in the chat. She said, can Peter give his thoughts on what power he thinks ordinary people may have to influence the trajectory of our path to tyranny, which is pretty clear in the United States? And one of the comments you make in your book is you monitor how the press is dealing with Hitler's rise. And I remember it sort of jumped out at me uh, the question of immediately opposing it or the acquiescence of civil society and all that. I mean, and again, this gets into a serious question like people have different responses to what's happening right now. And I'm just wondering, again, we get into this question of analogy. What are your thoughts on that?
If your question is how can a society, a civilized society, a civil society with a respect for law do this to itself, then you're already on the right side. But people didn't ask that question in 1933. The more important question was how will we finally get rid of the Marxists, the Social Democrats, and the Republic? This was far more important than a constitutional or even legal order. Maybe people didn't quite imagine what was going to happen, but on the whole, they understood that the Nazis were going to uh, take apart the old system. And it was not about constitutional rights or civil liberties or public sphere. It was about getting rid of the socialists. And if your interest was in the civil sphere or the public interest or the commonwealth or procedure, constitutional or legal or democratic procedure, then you would not be voting for the Nazis and you would not be supporting them. But that was not the question on people's minds who were thinking about Hitler. They wanted a new system, and they wanted, and it was not about a constitutional order. They were willing to sacrifice that if they saw that that was what the stakes were. And that's where the press comes in. You have a conservative right wing, let's call it just a conservative press. They knew full well that Hitler wasn't their favorite person, but way better than the alternatives, which was these 14 years of the Republic and these social democrats and Democrats. But by the way, it's not like the social democrats dominated the Republic, but that was far more important. Get rid of the political opponents and do so in a way that treats them as political enemies so that you create a new system. It was not about law and order or the constitutional order. And this is what we see in a large segment of the Republican Party today. They don't care about the game rules, the procedures, the checks and balances. They want to win.
Right. And again, it raises questions, listening to you talk about this, about the work.
Winner take all. Yeah.
Right. Well, the other issue it raises is that some people have different conceptions about the struggle between the KPD and the SPD and the whole issue of the Popular Front question. And your comments about the popularity with a large amount of the population, they didn't give a damn about all that stuff. They just wanted them gone. Alex, go on, Alex.
Yeah, again, thanks, Professor Fritz. Yeah, I want to ask some questions about the Nazi economy in Hitler's first 100 days. Because yeah, I'm curious your thoughts about how the Nazis, how they messaged their economic policies at the beginning of the Third Reich, we see right now again, the budget that Trump has proposed, and again, with the Republicans in control of both houses, they should be able to pass. And again, that's being portrayed as again, kind of standard
Yeah,
Republican. Tax cuts are gonna give
right,
us a wonderful economy.
right.
But I'm curious how the Nazis messed
Yeah,
with that, and how they dealt with again, because we know the economic, reality was again, it did not, turn out so great the first years of the because of their, simultaneously pursuit of autarky, but also, wanting to maintain their balance of
right.
payments and just the international trade environment of the time. So
Yeah,
I wonder how the Nazis, in comparison again what Trump
right.
is,
Well, unlike
how they
Trump,
kind of spun things essentially in the economy.
unlike Trump, Hitler inherited a terrible economy. Um, his first order of business was political against his enemies. So it's in a way what your question is the second 100 days, and what did he do economically? Now already there had been tons of austerity imposed, and a third of the people are without work, and they're without social welfare payments because those only lasted for 20 weeks. So they're really living on just on nothing. Municipal handouts and charity. The the civil service has already been pared down. Okay, so what does Hitler do? Well, Hitler creates within 3 months what is the equivalent of a $10 billion uh, uh, employment plan. Very quickly, that becomes a rearmament plan. He reduces taxes, but most of those taxes, it's not like it's on corporations. These are use taxes. These are consumer taxes, and he on consumers and on small business. So it is both a decrease in taxes as well as a huge program directed at the unemployed, who were then regimented. It wasn't so much fun to be part, but you saw the economy move. Many of these plans had been in existence, but he scaled them up vastly. And through currency controls was able to pay for them. He was also not interested in the economic orthodoxy of the time. So he basically created a Keynesian spending system to get plus state authority to get the unemployed employed and increase the purchasing power. He would have never attacked the civil service as such and the state. He wanted to enhance the power of the state. Simply, he wanted his party to control the state in the name of the racially pure German people. And so it's not as though he's dismantling the bureaucracy. What he's doing, which had already been paired, what he's doing is he's cleansing it. But then he's building back up through the government, through the Ministry of Finance, a vast program of work creation and tax credits in order to do that. He's also building up things like healthcare. So armaments becomes the biggest thing, of course. But he needs to solve a huge healthcare problem. So he's not undermining the German healthcare system, he's augmenting it. And with neonatal, postnatal, prenatal care, with municipal health offices. So it would be as if Trump were to expand Obamacare and would be to, but Hitler had an economic problem. Trump did not have an economic problem. And so it's So his solutions to this economic problem are, it's very difficult to compare. I mean, Hitler had 30% unemployment, and he had to get rid of that 30% if the Nazis were going to succeed, and he did.
And simultaneously, he engages in a round of privatization, but kind of at the same time, he's kind of increasing regulation and in particular again businesses that kind of don't go along with the rearmament program.
Oh, absolutely, of
Kind of
course.
the
And
younger is
without the
basically
state
out of the company.
authority, right.
So it's a
No, no, people fall into line. Yeah,
it's just there's this whole
absolutely.
long ideological argument about whether fascism is more government or again is it's the whole are they tools of the capitalists, the big capitalists in particular.
But Hitler had no intention of undoing capitalism, and that was an economic power that was serviceable for the state and the people. But he was going to regulate and shift around in unorthodox ways. So the austerity policy certainly had not worked, and the Nazis did not follow them or support them.
Um, yeah, and such a more specific, like was it basically just
He would not have added to
that
unemployment by cutting the civil service in a mass way. He cut out the people who were Jews or Democrats or socialists in the civil service.
But again, I'm also interested, yeah, and how again like the messaging of like how are they is it Goebbels, is he going around again, telling people again, this is a wonderful economy. How do they get the news out about this, improved economy? How are they kind of messaging it? It's just
yeah. So I mean, there's a newsreel of Hitler shoveling the first, spade of dirt on the Autobahn here and the Autobahn there. There's lots of propaganda. If you're unemployed, it all goes very slow. It all goes very slow. And every month that you remain unemployed and you're living on 12 marks a week is extremely difficult. And so it takes a while for promises to become realities, but there's no pressure on the government in the sense that there's not a public sphere of demonstrations or new elections or local elections in other places in Germany that would be bellwether elections. So he's able to contain political dissent, but at the same time, by the end of the summer of 1933, the signs of improvement are visible and exceed already whatever slight signs of positiveness had been there before January 33. So it's counter-cyclical. It is visible, but it doesn't happen overnight. Of course not.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. All right, Frank. Frank, go on.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, Dr. Fritsch. If we're using the analogy thing, you've got the Republican Party today that has many naysayers. They're in the shadows at the moment. But if we go back to Hitler and the removal of Ernst Röhm, one particular character that I was always interested in, and I went to the annexes of the New York Public Library and stuff to find out things. But Walter Book was the Supreme Court judge of the Nazi Party, and he apparently according to Haydn, was the one who ordered the executions of the SA at Lichterfeld. And he's a very, I guess, unassuming person as far as history goes, because he was the father-in-law of Martin Bormann. And there's a very interesting picture of him with Hitler in 1928 when all this starts to kick off. And he's of interest because the executions was a form of consolidation of the extreme kind, and he seems to have avoided history somehow. And I just wonder if you've got any particular information on him, and whether or not you can shed some light. Because one other thing I found out about him, and this was apparently a British spy was finding out that there were hearses going around in Berlin in the 30s and picking up people and then having them beaten up by Walter Book. But the guy was described as being short and squat, which is Martin Bormann, actually. So there's some interesting things there. And also, as far as power in Germany and how they dealt with particularly the communists at this stage, was putting them into the forerunners of the concentration camps. So another character that's also of interest is Theodor Eicke, who was apparently incarcerated and then released. So, the people around Trump are weird, to put it mildly, according to some, me. So have you got any remarks or insights as far as Walter Book and Theodor Eicke?
Well, the concentration camps are open. There's two of them that are opened on March 20th, and they are run by the party, and they are therefore outside of the judicial system, and they are designed to hold and contain political prisoners, most of them socialists and Democrats, social Democrats, but often quite prominent people, indefinitely. Most of them will get released, not all. The concentration camps then have various functions, but their first function in the first year, first 9 months, is political. And there's a staff of people who come out of the paramilitary ranks, who staff those early concentration camps and then go on to careers in the concentration camp world of the Nazis as the concentration camps move to social enemies and biological enemies. And Ike is one of them. And these all have long careers. But as with any paramilitary organization, of course, there are internal divisions. And you can go look at the Nazis very closely, and you'll see all sorts of people. Goebbels and Goering hated each other. You see all sorts of divisions. And you just read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Scheer, and it's just one unending crisis after another of this government, and yet it never falls, despite all expectations that it would, beginning with events like the Röhm Putsch in 1934. But I don't think these matter as much, and the internal divisions of the Nazis didn't matter. What there was a tremendous consensus held by the population, as well as the Nazi Party, about the virtue of the national revolution. And that national revolution is what they owed their careers to, if you're talking about the Nazis. Another way to think about it is that the German people, I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm saying use this just as an example of how to think about things. It was possible to hate the Nazis and love the Third Reich. Of course, the Nazis are corrupt. Of course, we don't like this one. Of course, we don't like the Gauleiter here. Of course, we don't like the Ortsgruppenführer here. Of course, they're corrupt. Of course, they're in cahoots. Of course, they're padding their pockets. But the ultimate Third Reich that I have put so much energy into and volunteered for and done this and that for, that had tremendous amount of legitimacy. So it's a question of what weight you give to all of these internal divisions. I don't give very much weight to them, and they never played themselves out until just a little bit with the plot against Hitler in 1944, when they had lost the World War and 5 million troops.
All right, we got you, Volker. Go on, Volker.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my own screen, which flickers all the time, but can you hear me?
We got you.
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, Peter, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to join this conversation. One question which I would have, could you talk about the Enabling Act? Because I'm always worried that we might have an Enabling Act also in this country, since there is so much constitutional confusion right now, and the significance of the Enabling Act of 1933.
Well, the justification for the Enabling Act, which is the suspension of the Constitution, is that Hitler had asked for 4 years. Give me 4 years' time and I will solve the crisis. And the crisis is visible, right, with the unemployment figures. And it also comes out of, is being justified by the communist menace, which is then played out through from the Reichstag fire and all the supposed evidence that is never shown about the vast communist underground, and that you need emergency powers. They'd already, in fact, taken over most of the German states by the time the whole parliament comes together and officially suspends the Constitution on the 23rd of March. What the Nazis don't have is a two-thirds majority to do so. And it's actually quite revealing how it is that they get their two-thirds majority. In the first place, they never banned the Communist Party. So the Communist Party attracts votes and gets parliamentarians through the March 5th elections. Then the party is banned. The parliamentarians are not allowed to take their seats. And therefore, the calculus of what is a two-thirds majority changes because you are no longer counting up the communist deputies. Number two, everything rests on the Catholic Party. What will they do? And the Catholic Party agrees that there's going to be a conventional parliamentary procedure that the faction of the Catholic Center Party will sit down and decide, and then everyone will abide by that decision. And there was debate about whether or not the Catholic Party should agree to this emergency legislation, the Enabling Act. In the end, they did, along with some minor liberal parties. And you have the transcripts of their discussions, and it is, we cannot go against the spirit of the people and the wave of enthusiasm, as well as the urgency of this moment. But it was mostly the impression of that the Nazis really already had far more than 40% of the population behind them. And this was not a moment to create disunity, but it was important to enhance and to distinguish this moment of German unity and moving forward. A totally flawed decision and logic, but it required the Catholic Center to pass the Enabling Act. Had it not been passed, I'm sure that the Nazis had enough tools in their toolkit. They already had emergency control over most of the, if not all the states, certainly Prussia, Bavaria, Hessen. So, but yeah, then it became a proper vote and a proper suspension of the Constitution, based ultimately on the emergency situations that the Reichstag fire seemed to have created, the communist threat first and foremost. But everybody knew on March 23rd, Germany was at a juncture, and it was either now going to move forward with Hitler or it was going to move back into disunity and perhaps civil war. And most people chose to take the step forward. And it was not about the Constitution or civil rights. It was about emergency. And in that sense, it's an interesting question you ask about today. This sense of emergency is already being legitimated it was legitimated in 1933 in the mind. It was not just a juridical thing, not just argued about with law professors. It was in the minds of the people. We actually do need a state of emergency to move forward. Once you accept that, you've accepted a lot.
You got Volker, you
But
have some other
Peter,
comments?
if I may come and
Please.
simply add, I think it legitimated the regime after the passage of the Enabling Act. And that's the problem now. We are having executive orders which are not legitimated by Congress. And it seems to me that that is still the difference, that the Germans in 1933 were confronted with a Hitler who said, pass this Enabling Act and then give me 4 years' time, because that was the running time for the Enabling Act, and you will not recognize Germany again. And indeed, after a year, you couldn't recognize Germany again. So that is, I think, the legal significance of this Enabling Act that we haven't had in this country, fortunately, so far, because if Congress legitimated Trump's and Musk's actions, I think there would be parallels to what we had in Germany in 1933.
I totally agree. What would be points of principle are put aside under the impact of the emergency that you impose upon yourself and whose terms you accept. And this self-imposition and self-acceptance goes from top to bottom. The one people didn't include were the Social Democrats, the brave Social Democrats, but included everybody else. The man on the street who was completely enthralled by the pictures of unity just 2 days before with Hindenburg and Hitler in Potsdam, the other parties and the Center Party and the American judiciary, which is why in the end, democracy depends on spirit and the content of the consent. It depends on a consensus and not just on laws. But people self-impose the sense of emergency upon themselves. And the one group that refused to do so, in the name of procedure, custom, history, were the Social Democrats. They were in the minority.
Volker, you have some more comments?
No, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. And I just want to add that I do think an enabling act has been passed, and that is U.S. versus Trump last July. And I'm watching with great trepidation the changes in the command structure in the Pentagon, which we all know from reading closely. You know, I had to coordinate reporters reporting on the first Trump administration for 4 years. So I'm well aware of the debates that occurred within the Trump administration over when he was being held in check by his military advisors, such as Mattis, Kelly, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And the issue of him invoking the Emergency Powers Act, I personally think he's looking for his Wilhelm Keitel and his Alfred Jodl as we speak. Michael. Go on, Mike. I'll get to you, Craig.
Well, what you mean by that is that he'll find his own military. And that's what happened in Germany. The idea that you could rely on a Reichswehr that would, by its own point of gravity, oppose Hitler is not true if its ranks have been changed and its leadership has been changed. And they were very sympathetic to Hitler anyways. And you already had court decisions that in de facto signed off on the assault on the Prussian government on July 20th, 1932. but but people also were accepted the terms that this was not about legality versus illegality or democracy versus authoritarianism. It was whether it was going to be the Nazis versus the Marxists.
Right. And that, of course, and there, we can sort of spend hours talking about that. Just will remind people to watch the hearing with the person who's up for Solicitor General. He's that attorney who made the famous comment in front of the judge about SEAL Team 6. Mike Jankowicz. Mike.
That there must be a glitch in the system. Well, first of all, I think it's ironic, or ironically coincidental, perhaps, that Hitler said, "Just give me 4 more years." But I wanted to ask the question that I'm sure is on some people's minds, which is that at this juncture in the 1933 to 1934, what, if anything, could have been done, which obviously wasn't, could have been done to stop or at least curtail Hitler's power grab?
It's an excellent question. And to answer that question, one's going to, you have to raise these psychological factors of the degree to which the Social Democrats and even the communists were dispirited. There's just going to be a lot of different factors in a satisfactory answer to that question, plus a kind of a blindness. No matter how radical they are, they're not going to obviously step out of the shadow of German history. Would be interesting to think about what would have happened had the Center Catholic Party really stood constitutional ground. But one knew that it wouldn't, because much of that party was already very sympathetic to the Nazis. One could have imagined more people out on the streets. It's a cold winter. There's 30% unemployed. The police powers in Prussia, 2/3 of the state, are controlled by the state. And in fact, even before the Reichstag fire, the Nazi brown shirts are deputized into that Prussian police force. That's February 20th, so a week before the Reichstag fire. It's hard, but yes, you could have had uprising. You know what I think? I think the best answer is it's not satisfactory in an analytic way. The left does not resort to what the right is willing to.
What do you mean, armed struggle?
Civil war, yeah. Not the social democratic left. I'm not talking about the communists right now. But part of the value system they were upholding incapacitated them in opposing. It's the argument, do you fight Hitler with Hitler? And do you have to in order to beat Hitler, do you use Hitler, right? The left is more disposed, because of its loyalty to the constitutional legal order, to step down.
Yeah, these are very interesting questions.
And I believe that is applicable to the United States as well.
Yeah, agreed. Go on. We're going to go through a final round here. So those of you who haven't wanted to say,
can Peter take a 15-second break?
Sure, of course you can.
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Laptop, I'm afraid, is not in good shape. I have to do something about it, and that explains why I have been.
Yeah, you could have just your sound's coming in great.
Also covered an enormous amount of questions and problems, and Peter Fritzsche is the expert, and I'm so glad that you persuaded him to join us for this talk. And the only thing I'm glad about is that we did get into socioeconomic questions also, because a lot of our discussion was, of course, about politics, ideology, mass communication, mobilization, etc. But I think there is an economic dimension to all this, as there is in this country. And the main problem that the Germans had, and Peter will probably comment on this in a moment, is that you had large sections of the population who were downwardly mobile. And when you are downwardly mobile in a society which at least is very prosperous around you with many billionaires, it is very difficult not to use the last power that you have, namely the power of the ballot box, and to show that you can still exert some influence. And I think that is what happened in Germany in the 1930s or 20s already, and it's also happening here. And that is why I'm glad we got onto the question of the not only the psychological state of the population here, but also the socioeconomic state, the poverty problems that we are having in this society, which the Germans also had, of course, even though they had some kind of a social welfare system, which had actually broken down in 19.
I mean, they had the best social welfare system, but it didn't meet expectations, and it certainly wasn't up to the challenge of the Great Depression.
Well, and Volker, I intend to focus in on this issue for the next couple of months in detail. So this is just the first of it. And Peters, it's great to have you. Go on, Craig. Sorry. Go on, Craig.
Okay. I hate to be the turd in the punch bowl here, but I just have to, as someone who since October of 2019 has put on organized nine Trump rallies in my little town, I'm just flummoxed and astounded how many of you think that Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump are somehow analogous. I mean, just look at the view from 30,000 feet. Adolf Hitler, his ultimate goal was to produce a racially purified society and get rid of anyone who didn't fit into that society. Donald Trump was elected with the most diverse electorate that any Republican has seen since Richard Nixon in 1960. He actually got I saw the other day, roughly 40% of the vote of Black men under the age of 40. And I honestly, we've already had Trump for 4 years. And I'll just to make one other point, and then I'll shut up. This bit about how the right wants to resort to violence and the left will stand back because it wants to follow the constitutional order. Look at all the court rulings that came out against Trump, against his so-called Muslim ban and all this. Trump punctiliously honored all these court rulings. He never told any of these judges to go pound sand, where if you look at both Obama and Biden, particularly Biden, when it came to the rulings, even came from the Supreme Court on no, you can't just write off $1 trillion in debt for students and force other people to pay for it.
Well, I mean, I think what you bring up are two very interesting things. The people in 1933 were not voting for the Holocaust, and they were not voting for the World War II. Right. And even racial aspects were not really foremost on their mind. I mean, they had a sense of that the real Germans or the true Germans or the virtuous Germans or us poor Germans had been blasted by history. But they did vote deliberately for a big political change. And they did deliberately vote against the Republic. And with that, against the Constitution. The other thing is that you talk about the large diversity in the electorate. And that's exactly why this is all going to be studied for a long time. Trump would not be Trump in 2016 had he not bucked the GOP. the interesting political drama is the GOP primaries in 2016 and his huge run up against those other candidates. And that's what's really going to have to be understood. However, if Trump was to be true to his electorate, he would forgive the student loans. And he would do one more thing. He would expand Obamacare. In fact, he would create a public health care system, a universal health care system. And if he did that, he would be a very, very powerful populist leader, much more comparable to the appeal of Hitler, who did deliver social and economic goods.
All right.
Well,
Yeah, Craig, we're these are the kind of issues we're going to argue about and talk about, as you know, and we'll have other opportunities because I know that I could argue with you for a couple hours on this one. But
well,
anyway, let me just get Alex, and I know Michael was sort of.
But yeah.
So one of the, I don't know if it's this early in the Nazi regime, the first 100 days, but one of the big things they do is to go after workers. They repress any essentially non-Nazi labor unions, but impose their own essentially. You have to be a part of the Nazi party to be in a union after a certain point. But that doesn't seem to have created any real labor action in terms of strikes and so on, and which they outlawed as well. So I'm just curious as to why you think there was such a non-reaction from the labor movement in Germany to those kinds of Nazi policies.
Well, there's a big social conflict in Germany between the employed who desperately want to remain employed and the unemployed. And they have very different interests and very different claims on the state conceptually. And the labor union represents those who are employed. But almost half their numbers are unemployed. The labor union is very, very hobbled in a period of mass unemployment. And it's very unclear whether it could command the kind of discipline that a mass strike action would require. And there were no strikes really throughout this period. And the big one is the Berlin metalworkers strike, but that's already fall 1930, and it failed. So workers are in a very, very poor position at this time. And they're aware of that, and the workers' movement itself is some are Nazis, some are communists, some are social democrats, is divided. But it's very hard to imagine concerted strike action for a political. You're talking about a general strike for political purposes. That's very, very difficult to pull off. Had been pulled off in Germany in 1920 in a very different economic time. And when the labor unions also thought that they could negotiate with the Nazis. And when they realized that they couldn't, then it was too late.
All right, Michael.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up. I wasn't able to on the question I asked before as to what if there were any specific things that could be done. For instance, at what point did the rest of Germany, the 53% that was not supporting him, were they just going along with it, or did his support rise? The more powerful.
It's a super good question. We that's exactly what we are still trying to figure out. And you just keep nosying around. Now, Goebbels himself was aware that he had to convince the majority of this 48% to come over to the Nazis. And it is, of course, a combination of coercion and consent, but how deep does the consent go? Is it opportunistic? Is it fearful? Does it become a conversion? It's, of course, a variety of those things. But the propaganda pictures, they're showing the choreography of conversion. But then people become so impressed with those pictures that they convert. That makes no sense to go against the majority of society. That not only do they have their own personal lives to get along with, they have their own social goals to pursue. And so the propaganda picture of mass acclamation, in fact, becomes more and more real over the course of the spring and summer of 1933. Does everyone become a fanatic Nazi? No. Does everybody agree with everything? No. Would they condemn Jews to their death? No. Would they want the owner of the nice Mexican restaurant down the street to be deported? No. Are they for the large, broad themes of the new regime? Yes. And does this require drama? Yes, it does. And some people don't go to concentration camps unless they deserve to go to concentration camps, is the thinking. And very quickly people come around. How deep is it? Deep enough.
Okay, Frank. Frank, go on.
Yeah, one quick question, really. You mentioned that after the Reichstag fire, the KPD was the scapegoat, and they started to arrest en masse. But the KPD had been doing very well in the elections relative to even the Nazis. And what we have today is outside state actors influencing our elections. There's no question that Russia has, through trolling and through the internet, done an enormous amount against our, free and fair elections, one could argue. Now, back then, Moscow Central ran the KPD. And it is interesting from the big picture to see that in France, the left took over, Blum, around about the same time as the KPD was basically, after the Reichstag fire, which was which is a strange occurrence, and people still don't understand whether it was Luber or what who caused it. And so, it's not just domestically that we should be looking at what's going on, but there are outside influences. And, it may be far-fetched for some to think this, but I certainly believe that some of what's going on is not just, simply a democratic problem within the United States right now, as it wasn't just simply a democratic problem in Germany in the 30s. Certainly, Hitler came from nowhere, really, 1928, as you pointed out. He only got about 3% of the vote. And then the next minute, bam, where'd he come from? I mean, this is, I think, worthy of more investigation, at least that.
Well, there are a lot of pre-Hitler movements, and but they are too reactionary, and they can't get out of the conservative nationalist Protestant milieu in which they've originated, and Hitler is able to do that, and he's able to do that by using a populist as well as socially open policies. I don't want to say socialist, but that there's going to be a kind of a social sense of responsibility that's expected of citizens and that the state will enact. The communists are the party that most of the unemployed. The membership is vastly changing. So people are members for a little bit, but then leave. It's a party that's very distressed by the economic problems as an organization. But it's true, it has 16% of the vote in November 1932. And the basic policy of the KPD is certainly controlled by Moscow. The problem in Germany is that most people chose simply to think of the Social Democrats, which is a very different creature and totally committed to the Republic, as like the communists. And they just threw them in the same pot and refused basically to work with Social Democrats and conducted campaigns against Social Democrats throughout the course of the Republic. In a small town, you would not have the Social Democratic workers and the bourgeois national middle class people interact whatsoever. These were just two worlds inside these Protestant towns. At the same time, that the split between the Social Democrats and the Communists is politically and legally very, very important to keep in mind. They're not just alike. They both do feed from the same people, the same families, the same extended families would have communists and Social Democrats. Dads would be Social Democrats, sons would be communists. And so there is a kind of an affection or recognizability that Social Democrats also have with communists. So it's a complicated question, but that would then become the social basis of the Popular Front, which is all Democrats, including communists, Social Democrats, and others, coming together in an anti-fascist front. Many people exaggerated the left-wing nature of the Social Democrats. And at the same time, both Social Democrats and communists recognized each other as coming from the same root that had been split apart by the issue of the war in 1914. So you can look at it constantly from these two different perspectives and see different things. But the foreign influence of Moscow is not at issue. What's at issue is the domestic enemy. And Hitler made no equivocation about that. The enemy is inside the country, not outside it.
Go on, Hal.
What's the role played by the Great Depression, and are Hitler scholars of a consensus that if there hadn't been a Great Depression, would Hitler have gotten into power, or would he have remained a sort of marginal 2 to 3% kind of politician?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. No, there isn't the consensus, but it's also how you ask the question. There's if you are focused on the National Socialist German Workers' Party, you must understand its success in terms of the Great Depression, which acts as an accelerant, and the unemployment graph goes up with the Hitler vote. But if you look at radical, anti-Republican, popular forces mobilizing against the Republic, you have, before Hitler, many of those. I call them small n, small s, National Socialists. You can call them pre-fascists. You can call them popular radical nationalists. And they are already pretty square against the Republic. And what they're not going to do is invade Russia in 1941. What they're not going to do is completely leave the community of nations. What they're not going to do is create elaborate legal sanctions against Jews. But in terms of the social base of the Nazis, that's prefigured in many, many movements. and but they're not as successful as the Nazis, but you do see it. And in fact, there's something startling. The patriotic vote for Hindenburg as the popularly elected president of Germany in 1925 is not just a nostalgic vote for a substitute Kaiser. There's lots of energy behind the Hindenburg victory in 1925, in the middle of the so-called Golden 20s. The best statistical predictor for Hitler's popularity in 1932 is the 1925 Hindenburg vote. And the 1925 Hindenburg vote completely switches from Hindenburg to Hitler. So the Hitler coalition is already there in 1925 with similar anti-Republican and populist even outlines and a growing comfort with democratic street politics. But if you just take Hitler's party without the Great Depression, it is difficult to imagine him going beyond 10%.
Huh, interesting. All right, Ted, you're the last comment and question.
But you had the German nationalists, right? Those are radical right-wing, anti-Republican, non-helpful people.
Right. And Peter, we could keep you on for hours, but we won't do that. Ted, please.
What if Trump is Hugenberg?
Oh wow, what a combo! Right.
That's a fascinating one. Let's think about that. I am a Japanese historian. I'm just marvel at the depth of the research you've been able to do, and the fact that we can actually examine the roots of something like the Nazi social revolution, or the social revolution the Nazis captured or helped create. I remember comparing the two films by Leni Riefenstahl. The one that got all the plays is the year after the one that was a bomb. Her first movie. I remember talking about the great Party Day rallies in Nuremberg, and that one showed Rome as a leading figure of the Nazi Party, and almost a challenge equal to Hitler. And I remember watching that in school and being highly motivated to continue my studies in German history, but I ended up in Japan. So when I look at in the 1930s, the evolution of the Japanese system that created the emperor system and then turned the emperor system in the 1930s, while Japan was at war, in a sense, in China. I'm talking about 31, 32, when they created Manchuria, and that whole period of time when the Japanese state was acting against the international law, having been after World War I, and very much the backbone, at least one of the strongest supporters of the League of Nations. And then when Japan is thrown out of the League because of Manchuria, there's a tremendous attention in American and British and other policies to Japan's actions internationally. But internally, what I was saying, with this conversation over the last couple of hours has been extraordinarily informative to me. And it led me back to, I've been reading up for it, reading back to my own studies of Hitler and the Nazi rise to power. But I'm thinking there was no such movement in Japan. The constant social unrest, because the Japanese government wasn't really chosen by the people. There were elections, and they chose politicians to be leaders, but the military was in charge, and largely in charge throughout the entire 1930 period. And so when we get to the crises period of 1937, you have a civilian prime minister, Hirota, who's going to be executed as a result of having been in the wrong spot at the wrong time after World War II. While Yoshida Shigeru, who is his big rival, who had been the ambassador to Britain for years, and whose memoirs and whose military attaché I've studied very closely, and their relationship to the whole Nazi, the pact with the Nazis, they opposed it. They thought it was a terrible mistake, and they tried to say that from London when they were there, but they couldn't affect the government. So when the crisis came in 1937, and then of course the horror of 1941, they were military been in charge, but one can hardly say that the Japanese population was innocent. They were not. They were excited by the conquest, and when Nanjing fell, there were huge celebrations. But the Japanese had lost hundreds of thousands of killed and wounded. 186,000, I think, is the number I have, of dead before 1940. one. And then, of course, they're going to lose 2 million civilians by the end of the war. So the war is quite different. But I'm not giving a speech here. I'm not trying to be a speech, but I'm saying I only wish that there was enough scholars pouring into the Japanese period to allow a discussion like this to occur in Japanese studies. I went to one in Berlin last September. It was a fantastic discussion of Japanese military violence inside the Japanese military system. And there were about 30 scholars there from all over the world. And we couldn't have had this discussion because none of us, even I would even say especially several of the Japanese scholars who are there, have done what you've done. And so I wanted to say thank you very much for informing me and giving me more insight so I can finish my book and maybe my next book and get this whole thing over with. But thank you very much, Jim, and for organizing it. But Professor Fritzsche, thank you very much for your work. And anyone else who spoke today. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Well, and I want to thank you, Peter, so much for spending time with us today, because obviously we're going to return to this subject again. And when is your new book coming out?
September it's called 1942, when World War II engulfed the world, engulfed the globe. And it is about the huge expansion of the war, obviously, from Singapore to Stalingrad. But it's also about Richmond, Virginia, Richmond, California, Johannesburg, South Africa, and how ordinary people are mobilized into the war as well and fight their own second fronts.
I want to thank you so much. It was really terrific to hear your thoughts about all this. And thank you so much for spending time with us today. It was really very rewarding to listen to your ideas and stimulating as all hell, because it's
Very
like
good.
I'm just
Well,
thinking.
thank you. And I mean, we're going to be discussing this for a long time because basically
Oh, yeah.
we're discussing why we think humans act in the way they do. We have a span of, opportunism, fear, to all the way to true love. And though that's what we work with and we try to figure it out.
Well, yeah. And again, we want to thank you for joining us today. It was just really rewarding and terrific to have you come. Thank you so much.